I never imagined getting into this circumstance where I'm doubting everything I felt that my faith was always strong, basis that was unshakable, or such I believed that the leader had been Pastor James of our church as long as I was able to recall that he was all positive. A preacher ought to be charismatic and compassionate, but there was something distinct from the way he handled me. And I didn't give it much thought at first. Began with basic gestures like a handshake. Spoke compliments that were a bit too lengthy. That seemed a bit too, "You have such a lovely soul personally." With a glance in his eyes, he would say. I dismissed it as I couldn't place it. I told myself he was only being kind, that I was thinking too much about. Ultimately, he was married, and I was aware of his wife, CLA, who was as committed to the church as he was on his side, always at. It was unimaginable that he would never go beyond any limits. But then the texts that arrived late at night were never unsuitable, at least not specifically, but something about the manner he would inquire about my day, or send me Bible passages that cheer me up at, why was I the only one who felt strange at midnight? He reached out to me in this way, so I attempted to disregard the nagging unease that grew, persuading myself with each message that, after all, it was all in my head. I had faith in him. He was my pastor one Sunday. Following the service, I was urged to stay behind by Pastor James. Believed it had to do with the youth group that I had been in charge of for several months. But as soon as I walked into his office, the door shut a bit too soon. Behind, I've observed that you've been aloof. Lately, he started speaking in a softer tone than as usual. I want to confirm that everything is all right. You can discuss with me. Anything okay? I nodded, a little uncomfortable. It was true that I had been uneasy, retreating, avoiding his messages, and attempting to keep our discussions to church as important. But now that he's sitting in his office, the door shut, and his gaze fixed on mine, I was at a loss for words. The atmosphere was tense, and I couldn't get rid of the tension I knew we both sensed. Then he approached, drawing his hand lightly in the chair next to mine, felt my heart when it touched my shoulder. Race, you seem anxious. Perhaps I might be of assistance. You got it, he said quietly in the room. Felt smaller all of a sudden, and I could sense the weight of his proximity and presence. I wanted to up and go, but something held me still. I never thought I'd find myself in this circumstance. Such as this. Pastor James was a divine man, someone I had long admired, but now in his office, we were sitting by ourselves. And everything seemed off. Yet I was unable to deny that I felt attracted to the comfort he appeared to offer in that, "Let's pray together for a moment," he said. Now nearly a whisper, but this prayer wasn't as comfortable as we shared with others in a church setting. This felt too personal for my hands. I shuddered when I took his what was occurring. Why I was unable to convey to part as Pastor James started to offer his. Even though the words were comfortable and familiar, his firm grip on my hands didn't seem to be the type of prayer I was familiar with his. His voice was soothing, but his grip was forceful. Carried an odd God, we fervently pray for your direction. During these confused times, he stated, but I was unable to stop wondering who was perplexed him, or his hand slipped away from mine and lingered, my wrist for an excessive amount of time. Prior to letting go. When the prayer was over, I sensed a heavy hush between us, the weight of his eyes, and it seemed as though both of us were anticipating something to occur that neither of us could. Admittedly, my heart was racing, and I could detect the difference between pastor and the congregation beginning to haze. If I hadn't already, I got up fast. Anxious to crack the tension, I should leave now. I muttered, avoiding his gaze, and he rose up as well. Approaching, and before I could respond, he touched my arm once more. You don't need to go right away. I want you to know that I'm always here for you." Although his tone was serene, his touch caused a panic attack in me. For the first time, I let myself really recognize the relationship that had been gradually expanding between us. Initially subtle, but now it seemed like an implicit knowledge that neither of we may overlook the fact that he was a divine guy, and I was a person who had approached him for direction, but it was becoming into something else hazardous, even though I know you're supporting me. I said, "I think I need some space." His fingers lowered, his voice faltering, And I initially believed he would overlook it, but rather his face relaxed, and he moved closer, obstructing my way to the door. I doubt you comprehend him. I care, he murmured, lowering his voice. More about you than you acknowledge. That the words weighed thick in the air, implied that I could sense my heartbeat. As his meaning became more apparent, quicken. The church was no longer the focus of this. Wasn't about me participating in his congregation or him as my spiritual. This was something more profound, leader intimate, and much more. I repeated, dangerous, I have to go. Solidly this time, but he didn't shift his. My eyes scanned mine for something, of comfort, as though he required me to confirm what was taking place between us. For a brief moment, I sensed the tug of desire to remain in order to observe where this would lead. But suddenly I was struck with reality, like, this wasn't just a man in a wave. This woman was standing by herself in a room. The person who baptized me was my pastor, the one who gave sermons on faith and ethics each Sunday. And he was standing too close and uttering statements that dissolved the boundaries I had maintained so wholly. I must leave, I said again. He pushed by him and headed for the door, kept me going this time, although I could. As I left his, I felt his eyes on my back, office that I love rushing as I entered the corridor. The faint familiar sounds of the church chatter of individuals discussing the watercourse of I was pulled back to reality by the wooden pews. However, the interaction with Pastor James ended. I avoided him for days because he made me feel uneasy. I kept to myself while sitting in the rear of the assembly, rather than my typical seat next to the. I chose not to respond to his texts and made reasons to avoid attending any meetings that could include us being alone ourselves. But I was unable to disregard the emotions that had begun to develop, emotions inside of me that I didn't want to acknowledge that we were there. And a week later, he texted me once more. But this time it wasn't merely an informal, we need to talk about check-in, but I can't quit worrying about you. My stomach dropped. I wasn't sure what to do. If I ignore it, I confront him. Boundaries had already been breached, and if I replied, I knew there would be no turning back. But in spite of all, I felt compelled to reply to a portion of, I was curious as to why this was occurring and the implications for us if there was a yes, and I wasn't sure why. Took what seemed like hours to type. We can't do this without a response, I wrote. As I press submit, my fingers shake. His response arrived almost instantly. Though I'm aware I doubt I can stop following his response, I experienced a surge of fear. What had I done to myself? I had always had faith in Pastor James, but I felt as though I was now stuck in something far larger than myself. Manage his remarks, which were repeated again, and it's difficult for me to think. Obviously, I don't believe I can stop. Was that what he meant? Merely a passing feeling or anything more hazardous? I was unable to return to his office. That is not, but the more I attempted to detach myself, the more the circumstances started to devour me. Each Sunday, I would sit in the avoiding his eyes at the rear of the church, but I sensed his gaze looking for me. Ceased going to sessions of youth groups and stayed away from any church events where I may yet encounter him. Despite my attempts, I was unable to escape the chaos inside of me, and one night my phone buzzed once more, this time a message from him. Can we just get together to talk? I have to. I looked at the screen and tried to explain myself. A torn part of me desired some sort of closure, of fixing this situation, but the alternative, I knew in my heart that seeing him again by myself, I wasn't sure I was. I left the message because I was willing to take unread in the hopes that he would get the hint. But during his service a few days later, he approached me in a discreet but quick manner. The point at which our paths met in the we really need to talk in the church hallway. Please, he said in a hushed, almost begging voice. His tense expression was visible to me. Identical conflict I'd been experiencing. He wasn't the self-assured pastor I was accustomed to notice that he appeared weak. Contrary to my better judgment, I agreed to have a public meeting with him. We'll have a conversation at the cafe by the church, I stated, emphasizing that there wouldn't be any dialogue. Once more behind closed doors, he consented and we agreed to get together the next day. Nerves were buzzing when I first arrived at the cafe. threw me when I took a seat at a tiny A piece of me was at the table beside the window, wishing he wouldn't arrive since this would all pass and we could return. Back to normal, but when I watched him move, my heart plummeted as I entered. This was actually occurring? He took a seat across from me and neither of us said anything for a moment. The conflict between us was evident that at last he shattered the we. I apologize for the silence, he said. I've been barely above a murmur. Battling this for a long time, I swallowed hard at that moment, unsure of how to reply, having trouble figuring out what I inquired in a harsher tone than I thought. He sighed while stroking his hair. I am aware of my feelings for you. I have been praying for it, but it's wrong. Direction? But I'm having trouble letting it go. You are more than just a person in my life. My congregation. His remarks struck me as a gut punch. This wasn't simply his fleeting infatuation was with he was unable to control my feelings. Part of me was at a loss for words, felt a peculiar sense of flattery that someone who is similar to Pastor James was meant to be above all that had been drawn to me, but I felt like the rest of I knew this wasn't right, and I was sick. I tried to bring up the fact that you're married, a semblance of reality returning to the dialogue with your wife. I know he can't do this, congregation replied hastily. I adore CLA, but I've never felt different with you, this previously, and I'm unsure of what to do. I shook my head in an attempt to consider everything. You can't just do it. These sentiments as a preacher, you're meant to guide us, but I stopped myself. Not sure how to complete the phrase. I didn't want to make any accusations against him. However, the reality was there. Dangling between, he leaned closer and spoke softly to us. But urgent, I'm not requesting anything. Incorrect. I simply need you to recognize how difficult this has been for me. You shouldn't feel the same way, in my opinion. But I wanted you to know that I gave him a glance, looking for any indication of the man I had always admired. Yet all I could see was someone who had stepped across the line, who had allowed his feelings to interfere with his obligations. This wasn't the guy I believed. I'm not sure what you're expecting me to do. Say, I answered in a tremulous voice. Although whatever this is, you cannot experience it. Must prioritize your marriage on you can't continue to pull me into. He nodded slowly as his features became hazy. I'm sorry, but I'm feeling guilty. Had placed you in this situation, so I got up, prepared to depart. But I believe we should keep our separation for some time. But I will still visit. I need space. Yet he didn't go to church. Dispute, he simply sat there and gazed down at the table when I left the cafe. I was aware that there was more to it than this. Too much tension and too much left unsaid remains lingering between us. But for the time being, I had to leave in order to breathe and to determine my course of action. Moving forward from weeks went by, and even though I made an effort to resolve the conflict between Pastor James and I, hung on like a storm cloud. Haunting my life, I attended church. Less often, always sitting in the never returning for the post-service discussions. I didn't answer his texts no more, as if he had ceased contacting as frequently as possible. The few texts I were packed with a weight that I had no desire to. Are you all right, Carrie? I miss our conversations. Our talks I choose to ignore, knowing that answering would only make me deeper into a circumstance I had to escape. But it wasn't always that simple. I sense his presence on Sunday at the draw pit. His sermons used to be full of inspiration and hope were now weighed down by unsaid words. And I was unable to refrain from, I wonder if the congregation as a whole observed the shift in one Sunday following an especially challenging service. Therefore, I chose to stay, not speaking with Pastor James, and I told myself that at least, but to collect my thoughts amid the silence. Most people had left their shelter, and when I heard the church was almost deserted. The sound of footfall near my heart fell as I understood that it was Pastor. I didn't expect you would stay. James murmured quietly as he stood a few steps away. He seemed fatigued as he moved away from me. Even though the burden of everything had finally managed to catch up with, I got up and was about to leave him. But I was stopped by something in his face. In a way, he appeared broken and defeated. Hadn't observed previously, I simply needed some silence. Answered in a calm voice and measured. He nodded. I'm not here to talk. However, he sat down instead of moving. His hands folded in one of the pews. I feel like I'm losing everything in his lap. Murmured in a scarcely faint voice, CLA the church. I'm not sure how to resolve this. I hesitated because I wanted to go. To go and let him handle the repercussions of his behavior. But another may be the aspect of me that had always had faith in him and sympathized with the man who served as my spiritual mentor, for I said, you need to speak with CLA for a long time. Not me, please, but I know he moaned and I'm not sure how to put a hand over his face. I am unable to even describe what is taking place in. It seems like everything in my own thoughts is crumbling apart, and I'm to blame for it. I sensed the weight of his remarks, the guilt burden that had been constructing for weeks or months. He wasn't only having emotional difficulties. He was having problems with himself, in my opinion, with his responsibilities as a spouse, pastor, and you must take it, man of faith. Accountability, I stated in a firmer tone. Now this is about more than just you. Everyone who respects and believes in you. You can't continue acting in this manner. If you ignore it, it will disappear. He glanced for the first time in weeks, looking up at me. I recognized something in his gaze. A man who previously guided me through difficult times of uncertainty and anxiety persisted. Somewhere beneath the muddle and instability, but I also understood that I couldn't. You're right, he needs your help to be saved, stated after a protracted silence. I've been avoiding it in the hopes that it would go away. However, I haven't been self-centered, and He spoke things that hurt individuals like you, suspended in midair, and I sensed the genuineness in them. He wasn't attempting to defend his behavior. He wasn't attempting to entice me into. At last, he was acknowledging his bewilderment, that he'd gone too far, and that it had repercussions. I regret, he carried on with his emotion-filled voice. I didn't mean I let my emotions to interfere in order to harm you. Way of what was right, and I am aware that I am unable to retract that. But I have to make things work. In line with CLA, the church, and I know I nodded, feeling a little weird. In his words, there wasn't a feeling of closure. The conclusion I anticipated, but it was the one that I hope you do, I added gently, needed. Go out to everyone's sack when I left the church that I had a weight reduction on that day. Shoulders, it wasn't completely over. Whispers would continue to ask inquiries, and possibly even hearsay. But I had moved away from what I needed to do, from a circumstance that might have Pastor James and I were destroyed. Never brought it up again, instead concentrating on restoring his connection with CLA, and once again, I found my place in the church. Even if nothing was ever exactly the same, my faith in him was betrayed, but I discovered that occasionally even the individuals, the people we admire the most may falter, and in some situations, we have a choice. The way ahead, and regarding Pastor James, he didn't leave the church, but he felt more humble after facing his accounting, and the path that lies ahead wasn't sure if he was at last prepared to take a solo stroll this time.